The wind howled like a wild animal, battering the ancient stones of Hawthorne Manor until the old estate seemed to groan in protest. It was the kind of winter's night that made the moors themselves vanish beneath a smothering blanket of white. The storm had blown in fast, burying the Northumberland hills beneath fresh drifts, swallowing up every familiar landmark, turning fields and forests into a vast, swirling oblivion. Out here, you could feel the weight of the wild pressing close. It was a world stripped down to the crunch of snow under boots, the shriek of the wind, and the bite of cold so deep it clawed at the bone. Edward Ned Hawthorne hunched his shoulders and pulled the battered wax jacket tighter around his frame, breath steaming in the frosty air. His old army-issue scarf was wrapped high up to his nose, but it did little to blunt the sting. He moved slowly, step by cautious step, navigating the dark with only a flickering lantern and his own hard-earned instincts. Every gust threatened to snatch the light away, but Ned pressed on, eyes narrowed against the stinging flakes. He was searching for firewood, anything dry enough to last till morning. The storm had cut the manor off from the rest of the world, and the larder was low. But he knew hardship. He'd faced worse than cold and hunger. At least here, in the shadow of the old family home, he could disappear. He trudged toward the edge of the property, past the tumble-down wall that separated Hawthorne land from the public commons. The snowdrifts here rose almost to his knees, swirling in whirls as the wind shifted. Somewhere in the distance, beyond the blinding white, the ancient forest pressed close, its bare branches like grasping fingers. Ned paused, lifting the lantern higher, listening. Out here, every sound was amplified, every creak and crack a warning. Then, just as he turned to head back, a desperate cry split the night. It cut through the wind, a high, raw sound that prickled at the base of his neck. Not a fox or a hare. This was something bigger, something in pain. Ned's heart kicked up, a soldier's reflex that never really left. He strained to pinpoint the direction, pushing toward the noise. The wind surged again, nearly flattening him, but he forced himself forward, boots crunching, lantern swinging. The cry came again, closer, frantic, pleading. And now he could make out two shapes slumped against the barbed wire fence that marked the Bellamy property. The figures were half buried in snow, coated in ice, sides heaving with effort. He staggered forward, lantern held out. What he saw made him stop cold. A black mare, wild-eyed and shaking, stood rigid between the storm and the world, her body curved protectively around a smaller form. Her nostrils flared, her sides slick with sweat that froze almost instantly in the bitter wind. She lifted her head as Ned approached, ears pinned, hooves shuffling. He murmured softly, hands spread wide, letting her see he meant no harm. Behind her, the foal, a small, coal-dark colt, no more than 10 months old, lay twisted in the snow, one leg splayed at an unnatural angle. Blood seeped from a wound just above the hoof, staining the white. "Easy now," Ned whispered, voice hoarse. He moved slowly, remembering the years spent gentling cavalry horses, reading the language of fear and pain in every tremor. The mare, Branwen, he'd heard the commoners call her, tossed her head, muscles bunched, but she didn't bolt. Maybe she sensed something in him, something battered and broken but still holding on. The colt, Pip, let out another cry, hoarse and pitiful, eyes glazed with panic. Ned dropped to his knees in the snow, ignoring the cold that instantly seeped through his trousers. He set the lantern down and examined the wound. A cruel steel trap, one of Bellamy's no doubt, was hidden just beneath the snow, teeth slick with fresh blood. Anger flared inside him, hot enough to chase off the cold for a moment. He'd warned Bellamy. This land wasn't his to ruin, but now wasn't the time. He fumbled with numb fingers, fighting the wind, until he found the release. The trap sprang open with a vicious snap. Pip whimpered, shaking all over, but Ned was quick. He ripped off his scarf, binding the wound as best he could. Blood soaked the fabric, but the flow slowed. He pressed his hand to Pip's neck, feeling the frantic heartbeat. Branwen nickered, nudging her foal, but didn't interfere. She stood sentinel, body shuddering, snow crusting her mane. "We're getting you out of here," Ned muttered. He glanced at the manor, lights a distant, unreachable glow. No way he could carry Pip that far. The nearest shelter was the old stone stable, a relic from the days when Hawthorne horses ran the hills. It was closer. If he could get them there, out of the wind, they might stand a chance. He scooped Pip up, muscles straining, teeth gritted against the pain that flared in his old wounds. The foal was heavier than he looked, every limp movement a reminder of his injury. Ned staggered forward, Branwen shadowing his steps, her hot breath on his neck. The snow stung his face, wind clawing at his ears, but he pressed on. Each step was a battle, the world shrinking to the crunch of boots, the foal's ragged breaths, Branwen's constant, anxious presence. At last, the stable loomed from the dark, a battered silhouette against the storm. Ned shouldered the door open, nearly collapsing as warmth washed over him. He eased Pip onto a bed of old straw, then turned to coax Branwen inside. The mare hesitated, stamping at the threshold, before finally stepping in, head low, eyes never leaving her foal. Ned dropped the bar across the door, shutting out the blizzard. He fumbled with his lighter, hands shaking, until a thin flame caught on the old logs in the hearth. The fire sputtered, then roared to life, casting long, wild shadows across the stone. The stable filled with light and the sharp, sweet smell of burning pine. Pip shivered on the straw, eyes drooping, but he was alive. Branwen pressed close, warm and real, her sides rising and falling. Ned knelt beside them, chest heaving, exhaustion threatening to pull him under. But as he watched the firelight dance on Branwen's black coat, as the blizzard battered the walls but couldn't get in, something fierce and unfamiliar bloomed in his chest. Maybe it was hope. Maybe it was just the relief of having saved something, even for a night. The wind screamed outside, the fire blazed, and for the first time in a long while, Ned felt the old Hawthorne blood stirring. The storm wasn't over, not by a long shot, but for now, he was not alone. The heavy wooden door rattled in its frame as the wind clawed and howled. Ned pressed his back against the stone, watching the two horses huddle together in the flickering light. The world beyond was a white void, but in this moment, in this battered old stable, life held on. And so would he. The blizzard roared through the night, shaking the walls of the old stone stable as if determined to tear down the last safe refuge left in the Northumberland wilds. Inside, Ned crouched low beside the foal, Pip, his breath coming slow and measured. The wound was deep, blood still oozing despite the makeshift bandage, and Pip's leg trembled with pain. Branwen watched every movement, her large dark eyes filled with the kind of worry that only a mother knows. Ned reached out and ran a gloved hand along her neck, murmuring, "You did good. You're safe now." But his hands, those strong, capable hands that had once commanded men and horses on parade grounds and battlefields, shook as he reached for the old first aid kit hidden beneath a rotting bale of hay. The trembling wouldn't stop, even when he gritted his teeth and willed it. The cold wasn't the reason. Not really. Not tonight. As the fire flickered, Ned's mind began to drift, memories surging up from places he'd tried for years to bury. He saw himself years ago, tall and proud in polished boots and crimson tunic, a captain of the household cavalry. He remembered the thunder of hooves on the mall, sunlight catching on golden helmets as they passed Buckingham Palace in perfect unison. Crowds cheered, cameras flashed, the nation's eyes watched him lead the king's troop. His father, then alive, beamed with pride from the stands. For a moment Ned had felt 10 feet tall, but then came Helmand. The desert sun, the choking dust, the endless weight of responsibility pressing on his shoulders. The sound of distant gunfire, and worse, the sudden, awful silence after. He remembered crouching behind a burned-out Land Rover, shouting orders as explosions echoed, and the world turned upside down. Men down, horses screaming in panic, chaos everywhere. The medal they'd pinned on him afterward meant nothing, not compared to the men he'd lost, not compared to the nightmares that followed him home. Ned blinked hard, forcing himself back to the present. The fire crackled, spitting sparks. Pip let out a quiet whicker, pain etched into every line of his body. Ned shook his head, trying to clear away the ghosts. He pulled off his gloves, fingers raw and red, and unwrapped the scarf from Pip's leg. The blood was sticky, but it had slowed. He cleaned the wound as best he could, hands still trembling. Each time his fingers brushed Pip's side, flashes of another night, sand instead of snow, shouts instead of wind, rushed through him. He squeezed his eyes shut. No, this was now. This was real. Focus. He reached into the kit for an old syringe of penicillin, checked the expiration date, then jabbed it into Pip's flank. The foal jerked, then settled as the pain faded a notch. Ned bandaged the leg again, layering torn strips of his undershirt beneath the scarf, tying it tight, but not so tight as to stop the blood. When he was done, he sat back on his heels, sweat prickling on his brow despite the cold. Branwen nudged Pip gently, nuzzling his ear, and the foal, exhausted, laid his head down and closed his eyes. Ned sat in the straw, staring at his hands. They were steady now, at least for the moment, stained with blood and dirt and old memories. The wind outside battered the stable, making the rafters groan, but he didn't care. The only world that mattered was the small circle of firelight around him. Suddenly, a sound shattered the quiet. A sharp, metallic pop echoing from somewhere out on the manor grounds. Ned shot to his feet, heart racing. For a moment, it was as if the war had come back to find him. He pressed himself against the stable door, every muscle taut, listening. Another sound, this time the low rumble of an engine trying to cut through the storm. The crunch of tires on frozen gravel. Headlights swept across the distant snowbanks, painting wild shadows on the old manor's crumbling walls. Who would come out here in a storm like this? Ned moved quickly, grabbing a rusted pitchfork and slipping through the stable's side door, careful not to draw attention to his hiding place. He crouched low behind a half-fallen stone wall, watching the lights crawl closer. The vehicle, a Land Rover, battered and mud-streaked, rolled to a stop just outside the main house. The driver's door opened, and a figure stepped out, wrapped in a thick parka, face obscured by a scarf and a wool cap. Whoever it was, they seemed determined, moving through the wind with quick, purposeful strides. Ned held his breath, every nerve strung tight. He knew the land well enough to use the shadows, to vanish if needed. Years of training and months of solitude had made him wary. Trespassers were rare, especially in winter, but not impossible. His mind raced through possibilities. Bellamy's men come to check their traps. Local poachers desperate for food, or worse. Someone sent to make trouble. The figure made straight for the stable, glancing over their shoulder as if expecting pursuit. Ned tightened his grip on the pitchfork, ready for anything. But as the stranger drew close, something about their stance, the careful way they moved, struck him as oddly familiar, almost practiced, not the careless swagger of Bellamy's hired hands. The figure reached the stable door, paused, then knocked twice, sharp and precise. Ned's heart thudded. Not an attack, then. He waited, silent. The figure tried the latch, but it held. Another knock. Then a woman's voice, clear and steady despite the storm, called out, "Is anyone in there? I saw the light. Please, I need to check on the ponies." Ned hesitated, pulse still racing, then set the pitchfork aside and drew a deep breath. He stepped out of the shadows, boots crunching in the snow, and called back, "Who are you? This is private land." The woman pulled down her scarf, revealing a pale, determined face with wind-burned cheeks and sharp blue eyes. "Amelia Hartwell, Royal Society for the Protection of Horses. I have reason to believe there are injured ponies here. Let me in." Ned's suspicion warred with relief. He'd heard of her, a vet from the city, known for her work with wild horses, her stubbornness almost as legendary as her skill. Still, this was no place for outsiders, not tonight. He stared at her for a long moment, then nodded. "Come in, but keep your hands where I can see them." Amelia nodded back, her breath ghosting in the icy air. Fair enough. As he led her into the warmth of the stable, the wind howled behind them, rattling the doors. The world outside was cold, brutal, unforgiving, but in here, under the low ceiling and flickering firelight, hope had found a foothold, if only for one storm-tossed night. As the wind screamed outside, the warmth inside the battered old stable took on the glow of a fragile miracle. Amelia Hartwell stamped snow from her boots and pulled off her heavy coat, revealing a lean figure in practical jeans and a sweater. Her face flushed from the cold and the effort of fighting her way through the blizzard. She set down her battered rucksack, flipping it open to reveal a portable X-ray unit, coils of bandages, and neatly packed vials of medicine. There was a quiet confidence to her every movement, the kind bred from years working on the edge of wild country and among stubborn, frightened animals. Edward kept his eyes on her, wariness warring with curiosity. He'd known plenty of city folk who thought they could handle the wild. Most of them were gone by spring, chased off by the weather or the silence or the hard work that came with caring for something other than yourself. But Amelia moved with purpose. She barely glanced at him, her attention zeroing in on Pip and Branwen, as if the rest of the world had faded away. Amelia knelt beside Pip, her breath catching as she saw the makeshift bandage. "You did a good job for what you had," she murmured, glancing up at Ned. "He's tough. That's a good sign." Her accent was clipped, polished, the voice of someone who had learned early to make herself heard in rooms full of men who underestimated her. But her touch was gentle as she ran her hands along Pip's leg, checking for heat, swelling, or signs of bone breakage. Branwen, the mother mare, tensed, snorting and stamping her feet, eyes wide. Amelia spoke in a low, soothing tone, her words soft and rhythmic, and Branwen seemed to calm, at least a little. Ned watched, a strange sense of relief loosening the knot between his shoulders. He'd done all he could, but this was a different kind of battlefield, one where steady hands and knowledge meant more than brute strength. Amelia shot Ned a quick, assessing look. "Do you have water that's not frozen solid?" Ned nodded, fetching a battered kettle from the fire and pouring warm water into a bucket. "He's dehydrated," she said, "and I need to take an X-ray, just to make sure nothing's shattered." As she worked, her breath misting in the cold air, Ned busied himself with the fire, adding another log and coaxing the flames higher. The scent of pine and old hay filled the stable, banishing some of the bitter chill. For a few moments, time seemed to slow. Outside, the blizzard howled, the darkness pressing hard against the tiny island of light. Inside, the world shrank to the circle of firelight, the crackle of wood, the soft murmur of Amelia's voice, and the steady rise and fall of the horses breathing. Amelia assembled the X-ray unit, positioning it carefully beside Pip's injured leg. She stroked his nose as she worked, whispering soothing nonsense while she guided the foal's limb into position. Ned marveled at her calm, the way she seemed to tune out everything but the task at hand. In another life, he thought, she would have made a fine soldier. The X-ray beeped, the image flickered onto the tiny screen, and Amelia exhaled, tension easing from her face. "No fractures. He's got a bad sprain, though. That's going to hurt like hell, but it'll heal, if he stays off it and gets proper care." She fished out a syringe, drew up a dose of painkiller, and injected it with practiced efficiency. Pip shivered, but after a moment his eyes closed, the lines of pain smoothing a little. Ned hovered uncertainly, watching as Amelia wrapped the leg with clean gauze, her fingers nimble and sure. "You said you tracked them?" he asked, keeping his voice low so as not to startle the horses. She nodded, glancing up with a small smile. "We started collaring the Fell Ponies this spring. Pip here's got a GPS tracker around his neck. When the storm hit, I saw his signal separate from the herd. When it didn't move for hours, I knew something was wrong." She gestured at her parka, which bore the Royal Society for the Protection of Horses crest, mud and snow still clinging to the badge. "I'm supposed to be in London right now. Couldn't sleep, knowing two of them might be out here alone." For a moment, silence fell, thick and heavy, broken only by the pop of the fire and the horses' quiet sounds. Ned understood more than he wanted to admit. Some burdens you didn't put down, even when the rest of the world said it was someone else's job. Amelia finished with Pip, rising and stretching the kinks from her back. "He'll need food, water, and warmth. If you have old blankets, bring them. And Branwen should be checked for injuries, too." Ned nodded, rummaging in the loft for spare blankets and a couple of battered horse rugs from his cavalry days. He handed one to Amelia, who laid it carefully across Branwen's back. The mare stood still, muscles twitching, but relaxed under the gentle touch. With the immediate crisis managed, the tension in the room began to ebb. Amelia glanced at Ned, a new softness in her voice. "You know horses. Army?" Her gaze flicked to the regimental pin still stuck on Ned's old coat. "Used to be," Ned said, voice rough. "Household cavalry. Long time ago." She nodded, understanding in her eyes. "My father was Navy. Different battles, same ghosts. A strange peace settled between them. A kind of unspoken truce born of exhaustion and mutual respect." Ned found himself almost smiling as Amelia dug out a battered thermos and poured 2 cups of Earl Grey, the steam curling up and filling the stable with a faint scent of citrus and hope. They sat together on a bale of hay, the world outside erased by snow and wind. 2 strangers bound for a few hours by the desperate need to save something small and precious. Branwen nuzzled Pip, and for the first time since the blizzard began, the foal's eyes softened, his breathing slowed. Ned sipped his tea, hands no longer shaking, and let himself believe that maybe, just maybe, they would all survive the night. As the fire burned low and the storm howled on, two tired people and two battered horses clung together against the darkness, hope flickering like a candle, fragile but refusing to die. Dawn came late and gray, a thin light filtering through cracks in the stable roof as the blizzard finally began to lose its grip. The air was thick with the smell of wet earth, pine smoke, and horses. Ned blinked sleep from his eyes, his back sore from a night spent on cold stone. Across the stall, Amelia was already up, fussing quietly over Pip, her brow creased in focus as she checked the bandages and offered the foal a small bucket of warm mash. Branwen, the mare, nickered softly, her breath misting in the icy air, always vigilant, never straying more than a step from her injured colt. For a moment, the stable felt almost peaceful, a small, battered sanctuary holding back the wild world outside. But peace, Ned knew, was a thin, fragile thing. As he stood and stretched, his gaze drifted to the window. Beyond, the land was still buried under snow, but the storm's edge was lifting, and the outlines of the Northumberland hills began to emerge, ghostly and pale in the morning gloom. Amelia moved with a quiet urgency. "He's stable," she said, not looking up from Pip. "But he can't stay here. Not with that leg, and not with Bellamy's men roaming around." Her words hung in the air, sharp and cold. Ned knew she was right. Bellamy, lord of the new development next door, would not hesitate to make trouble if he found the ponies on his land, especially after last night. He fetched a faded tartan blanket from an old trunk, shaking off dust and memory alike, and draped it over Pip's back. The foal nuzzled his palm, searching for comfort. Ned swallowed hard. "What do you have in mind?" he asked, turning to Amelia, the lines of fatigue still etched deep on his face. She pulled a folded map from her rucksack and spread it across a feed barrel, weighing down the corners with rocks and a horseshoe. The map showed the tangle of hills, rivers, and forests that stretched from Hawthorne Manor to the National Reserve at Kielder, nearly 40 kilometers as the crow flies. Much longer, given the weather and terrain. Amelia's finger traced a winding path along the edge of the Cheviot Hills, skirting the frozen streams and the wide, open moorland. "If we can make it to the sanctuary, the staff can take over. There's a heated barn, proper medical equipment. They'll be safe there, both of them, but it'll be slow going with Pip's injury." She shot Ned a level look. "I'll need your help. I can't manage this alone." Ned studied the route. The snow would be deep on the back trails, and the main road was likely impassable, or worse, watched by Bellamy's men. The old cavalry training kicked in, running through options, risks, backup plans. "I've got something that might help," he said. He disappeared into the dark end of the stable, rummaging through piles of canvas and forgotten gear. After a moment, he emerged dragging an ancient military-issue snow sledge, its paint faded, but the runners still sturdy. He grinned, a flash of pride in his eyes. "Army surplus, hauled wounded soldiers and gear across tougher ground than this." Amelia inspected the sledge, running her hand along the battered wood. "Perfect," she said, a note of hope in her voice. "If we pad it out, Pip can ride. Branwen'll follow as long as she can see him." The next hour was a flurry of preparation. Ned packed hay, blankets, and as much dried feed as they could carry. Amelia gathered her medical kit, syringes, bandages, a portable GPS tracker, and extra batteries. She checked Pip's injury again, tightening the bandages, then coaxed the foal gently onto the sledge. Branwen followed, eyes wide but trusting, her head pressed to Ned's shoulder as he soothed her with a few quiet words. The plan was risky, 40 kilometers through snow and ice, with a storm barely behind them and the threat of Bellamy ahead. But there was no other choice. The land itself was both enemy and ally. The tangled woods and frozen streams might hide them from prying eyes, but a wrong step, a slip on the ice, and everything could come undone in a heartbeat. Amelia checked the map once more, plotting waypoints along the riverbanks, marking the safest crossings, noting old shepherd huts that might offer shelter if the weather turned again. "We'll keep off the main roads," she said, her voice steady. "The less Bellamy knows, the better. But if anything goes wrong, if Pip takes a turn, or we're spotted, you get the ponies to safety. I'll deal with the rest." Ned nodded, the old instincts settling over him like armor. He tightened the straps on the sledge, adjusted the lines on Branwen's halter, and checked the antique cavalry revolver he kept hidden in his pack. He'd sworn off violence, but Bellamy didn't play by the old rules, and Ned wasn't about to let anything happen to the ponies, or Amelia. They stepped outside together, the world dazzling in the morning light, every surface glinting with fresh snow. Their breath hung in the air, mingling with the last echoes of the storm. Ned took the lead, guiding the sledge through the gate. Branwen pressed close behind. Amelia followed, the map tucked under her arm, her expression a blend of determination and anxiety. As they made their way across the frozen pasture, the silence was broken only by the creak of the sledge, the snort of Branwen's breath, and Pip's soft, anxious whinnies. They moved slow but steady, each step carrying them farther from the safety of the stable and deeper into the unknown. For a moment, as the manor shrank behind them, Ned looked back and saw only a ghost of his old life, fading in the snowy dawn. Ahead, the world was white, endless, and full of danger, but also possibility. He squared his shoulders, glancing at Amelia, and found strength in her steady presence. They were strangers, thrown together by accident and necessity. But as the hills rose up before them and the journey began in earnest, Ned realized something had shifted. This was no longer just about surviving a storm or outsmarting a cruel neighbor. It was about doing what was right, about finding hope, even in the darkest of winters, and refusing to let it go. The wind picked up, swirling snow around their legs, but they pressed on, two battered souls and a pair of wild ponies setting out across the frozen wilds. Hearts pounding, the fire of purpose burning in their chests. The first pale gleam of morning had barely pushed aside the shadowy grip of the storm when the small group set out across the snow-laden pasture. Ned led the way with slow, measured steps, the battered sledge trailing behind him, its runners hissing over the frozen ground. Pip lay curled in a nest of blankets and straw, his big eyes watching everything with a mixture of fear and exhaustion. Branwen stuck close, her breath steaming in the icy air, muscles tense but resolve unwavering, her gaze flicking from her foal to the world ahead. Behind them, the ancient outline of Hawthorne Manor faded into the gray mist. Every crunch of snow beneath their boots, every creak of leather and wood, seemed to echo louder than a gunshot in the hushed wild. Ned's mind spun with the risks. The storm had broken, but Bellamy would not have. The man was like winter itself, relentless, cold, and determined to drive out anything that threatened his vision of progress. Ned felt the weight of the revolver hidden at his hip. Not a weapon he wanted to use, but a symbol that he would protect these ponies and this land, no matter the cost. Amelia marched beside him, her jaw set with determination, the old map clutched in one gloved hand, her other resting protectively on the sledge. She glanced at Pip often, her voice soft whenever she leaned in to comfort him. "Almost there, boy. You're doing great." Each word was a thread pulling them forward, knitting hope into the frozen air. The world was silent except for the whisper of wind and the occasional distant croak of a raven. As they approached the lower boundary of the estate, where Hawthorne land ended and Bellamy's new kingdom began, Ned felt every muscle tighten. The map showed a direct path through the birch copse, across a shallow, frozen brook, and over the common ground to the forest's edge. But that ground was now divided by more than old stones and tradition. A new steel fence loomed ahead, stark and cruel, running the length of the snowy field, a foreign scar across the wild. The fence was fresh, thick, gleaming wire, hammered deep into the ground, topped with coils of barbed steel. Bellamy's hired hands had wasted no time. Alongside the fence stood two men in heavy jackets and fluorescent vests, one with a radio crackling at his belt, the other gripping the leash of a burly, snarling hound. Behind them, a third figure waited in an immaculate tweed coat, a hunting cap pulled low, a smirk already curling his lips. Lord Marcus Bellamy himself, the so-called lord of the manor. Bellamy's presence made the cold feel sharper. He leaned against the fence, the picture of relaxed arrogance, his eyes glittering as the small group approached. "Well, well, if it isn't Captain Hawthorne and the famous Dr. Hartwell," he called, voice thick with amusement and contempt. "Out for a little stroll, are we? I suppose you're looking to poach some of my stock." Ned's jaw tightened. He stepped forward, keeping his voice calm but his stance unyielding. "They're not yours, Bellamy. These ponies belong to the commons, same as always. We're moving them to the reserve for treatment and safety." Bellamy waved a hand dismissively. "Not anymore, old boy. Everything on this side of the fence is now my concern. These creatures have been damaging my property. I've got every right to keep them as evidence of trespass." He motioned to the guards, who tensed, their dog barking viciously, straining at the leash. The standoff hung in the air, brittle and dangerous. Amelia stepped up, her voice cutting through the tension like a scalpel. "Pip is injured. If you cared at all about animal welfare, you'd let us pass. Or do you want a crowd of reporters showing up to see a wounded foal left to die on your land?" Bellamy's eyes narrowed, a muscle twitching in his cheek. "Careful, Doctor. That sounds a lot like a threat." He leaned in, dropping his voice. "This land is changing, and so are the rules. I'd hate for anyone, horse or human, to get hurt because they can't let go of the past." The threat hung there, sharp and cold. Ned glanced at Amelia, then at Branwen and Pip. He saw fear flicker in Amelia's eyes, but something harder too: defiance. For a moment, time froze. The only sound was the dog snarling, the wind rattling the fence, and Pip's faint, anxious whinny. Ned stepped back, raising both hands. "We don't want trouble, Marcus, but we're not leaving these ponies here." He turned to Amelia, speaking low. "We're taking the long route. There's an old shepherd's trail to the west. Dangerous, but it'll get us around the fence. Can you manage it?" Amelia nodded, her face pale but resolute. "I'm with you." Ned gave Bellamy a last, level stare. "You haven't seen the last of us," he said, voice steady as steel. Bellamy only smiled wider, teeth flashing. "I look forward to it, Captain." They retreated, Ned pulling the sledge into the shadow of the trees, Amelia guiding Branwen close. The western trail was barely more than a memory, a line through brambles and thickets, crusted with ice, the path choked by downed branches. Every step was a gamble. Snow slid beneath their feet, the world around them closing in. Pip whimpered as the sledge jolted over roots and rocks, but Amelia murmured encouragement, feeding him bits of apple and grain, while Ned broke trail, hacking away through the brush. Behind them, the fence and the threat of Bellamy's men never faded. More than once, they glimpsed figures moving along the boundary, radios crackling, dogs barking, always watching. The journey became a race against time and exhaustion, a test not just of strength, but of faith. As the day wore on, the sun rose higher, silver and cold in a pale sky. The forest pressed close, shadows thick and restless, yet every obstacle, every snag of wire, every tangle of bramble, only hardened their resolve. Ned pushed on, Amelia's determination matching his own. Branwen stayed at Pip's side, never faltering, her presence a living shield. Finally, as dusk crept over the hills, they emerged onto a high ridge, the reserve's distant tree line barely visible in the fading light. They were battered, bruised, exhausted, but undefeated. Below, Bellamy's steel wall snaked across the landscape, implacable and ugly, but behind them now. The cold bit deep, but hope burned brighter. For the first time all day, Ned let himself believe they might just make it. And somewhere in the gathering dark, Bellamy watched and waited, planning his next move. The old shepherd's trail vanished and reappeared beneath deep drifts and wind-thrown branches, forcing Ned to blaze a path through tangled undergrowth as the last light bled from the sky. The sun, pale and cold, hovered behind a haze of ice crystals. Every breath burned, every muscle ached, and the cold pressed in like a living thing. Above them, the trees creaked and groaned under the weight of snow, the sound echoing through the dusk. Amelia pushed on, refusing to let exhaustion slow her stride, her gloved hand resting protectively on Pip as the sledge rocked and jolted along the uneven ground. It grew colder. By the time the group reached the mouth of a narrow ravine, its walls slick with ice and lined with black stone, the temperature had dropped again. Branwen's breath came in soft clouds, her hooves slipping on frost-laced grass. Pip, weak but stubborn, whimpered and tossed his head as the sledge lurched, his wound reopening, fresh blood seeping through the bandages. The sight sent a surge of panic through Amelia. She knelt in the snow, her movements quick but gentle, pulling away the soaked fabric. Her breath caught as she saw the raw, angry red of the injury. "We have to stop," she said, voice trembling from cold and fear. "He's bleeding again." Ned glanced at the sky. The dark was coming fast, and the wind moaned through the trees, raising hackles on the back of his neck. He wanted to say no, they couldn't afford to lose time. But one look at Pip's pain-racked body and Branwen's anxious, protective stance silenced any argument. Ned helped Amelia lift the foal gently off the sledge and into the shelter of a rocky overhang. The cold stone pressed against their backs, the meager fire Ned coaxed from damp kindling fighting to hold back the freezing night. Amelia's fingers worked fast, trembling as she cleaned and dressed Pip's leg by firelight. The blood was sticky and dark, and the foal trembled with every touch. Branwen pressed close, eyes wild and white, snorting every time Amelia's hands tightened a bandage or Pip whimpered in pain. Ned knelt nearby, ready to block the mare if she became frantic, but she stayed just enough in control, the desperate need to help her colt outweighing her fear of strangers. Amelia bit her lip, stitching the worst of the torn skin closed with a battered needle and nylon thread. "Come on, Pip. You're stronger than this." Her voice wavered but never broke, Each stitch was a battle. Her hands numb, her mind racing through everything that could go wrong. The world outside the small circle of fire was nothing but darkness and the rising wail of the wind. But inside, the only thing that mattered was keeping Pip alive. Ned watched Amelia work, the memory of another battlefield surfacing unbidden, the stink of blood, the chaos of wounded men and horses, the shriek of shells overhead. He shook himself free from the flashback, focusing on Amelia's calm determination, the way she ignored her own shaking hands and the relentless cold. He found a flask of water, holding it for her when she asked, and pressed Pip's side gently when the foal thrashed. Amelia's lips moved in a silent prayer, her eyes shining with tears she refused to shed. When the final knot was tied and the bandage secured, she let out a long, shuddering breath, pressing her forehead to Pip's mane. The foal was breathing, his eyes glassy but no longer rolling in terror. Branwen leaned in, nuzzling them both, her own trembling finally subsiding. "We'll need to rest here a while," Amelia whispered, voice raw. "If we push him now, we'll lose him." Ned nodded, pulling his coat tighter. He checked the ammunition in his old revolver by habit, the sense of threat lingering even though the night was still, too still. He scanned the shadows, every sound sharpening his nerves. The cold seeped into his bones, bringing with it the ache of old wounds, both physical and invisible. As they huddled together, the wind shifted. Somewhere in the distance, a dull, rumbling roar made the ground vibrate. Ned's head snapped up. The earth trembled for a few heartbeats. Then came the unmistakable crack and rush of snow, an avalanche or a heavy drift collapsing into the ravine behind them. The narrow trail they'd followed was now blocked, the way back sealed beneath tons of fresh snow and ice. "Damn," Ned muttered. He rushed to the mouth of the overhang, lantern swinging. The white wall was unmistakable, blocking out the little moonlight there was. They were trapped on this side. No way back, only forward into the thicker wild. Amelia joined him, her face pale with exhaustion. "What now?" "We keep going," Ned said, jaw clenched. "There's no turning back." The only option was to push ahead, following the ravine east toward a thin line of trees that, if the map was right, would eventually lead to an old drover's path running toward the reserve. They spent what was left of the night in uneasy rest, trading shifts to keep the fire alive. Branwen pressed close to Pip. Amelia curled under a blanket with her back against the foal's flank. Ned barely slept, haunted by the memory of Bellamy's men and the new dangers the land itself presented. Several times he rose to scan the ridge with his lantern, searching for shadows among the snow. Dawn came thin and gray, painting the world in blue and silver. Pip's breathing was easier. Amelia's eyes were red from lack of sleep but full of stubborn hope. Ned packed up camp, hands numb, and together they lifted Pip gently back onto the sledge. Branwen followed, head down, every muscle taut with fatigue and anxiety, but she never faltered. They pushed forward, away from the collapse, each step a victory against exhaustion and despair. The snow was deeper here, the ravine closing in on both sides, the wind whistling overhead. But somewhere ahead, beyond the trees and the cold and the blood, hope still waited. Ned caught Amelia's eye as they pressed onward. "We're not giving up," he said quietly. "Not now." She nodded, her voice strong despite the night they'd endured. "We can do this. For them." Behind them, the world they'd known was gone, buried beneath snow and silence. Ahead, the wild country stretched, dangerous and unknown. But they pressed on. 3 battered souls and 2 wild ponies. united not by fate but by choice, and by the stubborn refusal to quit. The morning sun rose low and sharp over the Northumberland hills, gilding the endless snow in a pale, fleeting gold. Ned, Amelia, Branwen, and Pip pressed forward, moving with caution through the icy ravine, every step a reminder of the night's ordeal. Pip was quieter now, eyes clouded with exhaustion and pain, but he clung to consciousness, nuzzling Branwen's nose when she bent to reassure him. Amelia checked his bandages at every stop, her fingers red with cold, her breaths coming quick and visible in the frozen air. She caught Ned's eye with a look that was half gratitude, half determination, and together they forged ahead. They soon reached the edge of a wide, open valley. Beyond, a thick stand of pines marked the last barrier before Kielder's sanctuary lands. In between stretched Lake Kielder, now transformed by the deep freeze into a broad, glittering sheet of ice. The wind danced over its surface, whistling in wild, high-pitched shrieks, scattering powdered snow like mist. It was beautiful and deadly, a risk, but a shortcut that could save them hours, maybe more. Ned knelt to test the ice at the shore. It was thick, hard as stone, but slick and treacherous. "If we cross here, we can make the boundary by midday," he said, voice low. "If we circle the lake, we lose time, and I don't trust what might be waiting on the far shore." Amelia scanned the horizon, then checked her GPS tracker. The signal for the rest of the Fell Pony herd pulsed weakly from somewhere within the sanctuary. "We don't have a choice. We'll go together. I'll walk beside the sledge and watch for cracks." Ned nodded. They prepared quickly, Branwen trembling but resolute, Pip blinking at the sudden cold of the lake wind. Ned tied a rope from his waist to the sledge, ensuring he'd feel every shift and strain. Amelia carried the emergency medkit, her other hand guiding Branwen. Step by step, they made their way onto the ice, boots and hooves slipping and scraping, the sledge gliding with a sickening smoothness across the polished surface. The first few minutes passed in tense silence. The lake seemed to stretch forever, a white void beneath a sky that promised both salvation and peril. Then, behind them, a far-off rumble echoed from the edge of the trees. Ned stiffened, his senses snapping to attention. On the opposite shore, the quiet of the morning shattered. Two black SUVs crunched over the packed snow, engines howling, figures spilled out. Bellamy's men, radios slung over shoulders, fluorescent vests flashing like warning lights. Behind them, a drone whirred into the air, its camera glinting in the sun, sweeping the frozen expanse with cold precision. "They found us!" Amelia cried, her voice slicing through the wind. The sound of barking, dogs angry and eager, carried across the ice. The chase was on. Ned clenched his jaw, hauling on the rope, his every muscle burning with adrenaline and dread. "Faster! We have to move!" Branwen broke into a clumsy trot, hooves sliding dangerously. But she pushed on, Pip whimpering in the sledge behind her. Amelia sprinted at Ned's side, breath sharp and quick, eyes darting between the ponies and the distant threat. The drone zipped closer, the high-pitched whine growing louder, its shadow sweeping across the snow. Bellamy's men shouted from the shore, unleashing their hounds, which skidded and scrambled at the edge of the lake. The SUVs circled around, seeking a way to cut them off. Ned's boots slipped, nearly sending him sprawling. The sledge wobbled, skidding sideways, ice groaning beneath their weight. "Keep straight," he barked. "Don't let the sledge turn." Amelia threw her weight to the other side, correcting their course. Branwen whinnied in panic, but stayed upright, the love for her foal giving her the courage to carry on. Suddenly a loud crack split the air. The ice beneath the sledge shivered. A thin line snaked away from the runners, racing toward the distant shore. "Don't stop!" Ned shouted, sweat freezing on his brow. They raced forward, the world reduced to the rush of wind, the scrape of boots, the frantic drumming of Pip's hooves on the wood. Another crack, louder now, zigzagged toward them. Amelia's foot slipped, sending her skidding. Ned caught her arm, yanking her upright. Behind them, the drone dipped low, its camera lens gleaming like an unblinking eye. On the far side of the lake, Bellamy himself stepped from the lead SUV, a pair of binoculars in hand, face tight with fury and anticipation. The crack widened, opening a narrow fissure in the ice, water glimmering beneath. The sledge lurched, teetering on the edge of disaster. Branwen spun, eyes rolling, and bit through the old leather harness in a single desperate snap. Free, she lunged forward, gripping Pip's neck in her teeth and dragging him from the sledge with raw mother's strength. Ned and Amelia tumbled to their knees, scrambling after them. "Go, Branwen, go!" Ned yelled, his voice hoarse. The mare didn't hesitate. She hauled Pip clear of the sledge just as the ice gave way behind them, swallowing the battered contraption in a splash of icy water and shattered wood. Ned seized Pip's mane, Amelia clinging to Branwen's side as they staggered off the broken ice and back onto solid ground at the far edge of the lake. Their legs shook, their breaths came ragged and fast, but they were alive. Behind them, Bellamy's men howled with frustration, the drone circling overhead as if refusing to accept defeat. They tumbled into the snow, Branwen braying victory, Pip shuddering but safe beside her. Ned collapsed, arms wrapped around Amelia, the two of them shaking with relief and terror. "We made it!" Amelia gasped, pressing her face to Pip's neck. "We actually made it." But as the adrenaline faded, Ned heard the drone still buzzing above and saw the distant shapes of Bellamy's men moving along the tree line. The chase wasn't over, not yet. But for now, against every odd and every enemy, they had crossed the ice together and survived. He pressed his forehead to the snow, heart pounding. "We keep moving. We don't stop until we reach the sanctuary." Amelia nodded, brushing tears from her eyes, her voice fierce and steady. "Not until they're safe." So they rose again, bruised, battered, unbowed, and disappeared into the forest, the shadows closing behind them as the sun climbed over the world, bringing with it a sliver of hope and the unbreakable bond that had carried them this far. The trees swallowed them, their trunks thick and close, a wild tangle of pines and winter-bare birch huddled together against the edge of the frozen lake. Amelia's lungs burned as she ran, every muscle shaking from cold and adrenaline. The world behind her a blur of shattered ice and angry voices. Branwen led the way, flanks heaving, Pip limping alongside, his injured leg barely supporting him, but his spirit unbroken. Ned moved at the rear, glancing back every few seconds, his eyes never resting, listening for the crack of a branch or the baying of Bellamy's hounds. The woods offered some cover, but not nearly enough. The distant whine of the drone echoed through the treetops, circling overhead, a relentless eye searching for them from above. Ned signaled to Amelia to move beneath a cluster of evergreens, their thick needles providing a little shadow, while he dragged a branch behind them, scuffing out their tracks as best he could. Amelia crouched, pulling Pip close and checking the makeshift bandage. Blood had seeped through again, and the foal shivered violently, but he was alive. She stroked his nose, murmuring soft encouragements, refusing to let despair settle in. Branwen stood guard, head high, her ears swiveling at every sound. The mare was exhausted, but every inch of her radiated defiance. She would not give up her colt, not to men, not to the winter, not to anything. Somewhere to the south, a dog barked, a deep, ugly sound that sent a jolt of panic through all of them. Ned scanned the tree line. "We have to move now," he whispered. "They're closing in." They pushed deeper into the woods, Amelia half carrying Pip, while Ned guided Branwen with a steady hand. The forest grew thicker, the snow softer, swallowing their steps in silence. Overhead, the sky was turning iron gray, the promise of another storm heavy in the air. Ned's mind raced through every survival lesson, every bit of old cavalry lore. Stay low, keep moving, never make a straight line for safety. Circle back if you have to. Trust the land, not the enemy's eyes. Suddenly, a piercing red flare shot into the sky, trailing smoke and light over the trees. Another answered from farther off. A signal. Amelia's heart leapt. That's the sanctuary team. They must have seen the drone, maybe even picked up the tracker signal. Ned looked back, a hard edge in his eyes. We can't let Bellamy's men reach them first. Let's go. They set off at a desperate pace, the world shrinking to the crunch of snow, the panting of the horses, the drum of their hearts. The flares burned bright above the treetops, guiding them north and east, deeper into the woods. The sound of engines faded, replaced by the distant calls of human voices. One set hard and businesslike, another cruel and impatient. Bellamy's men were still out there, pushing through the woods with their dogs and radios, but the sanctuary staff was closer now, hope flickering just beyond reach. A sudden shout rang out behind them, a man's voice, furious, close. Branwen snorted, Pip staggered, and Amelia nearly tripped. Ned spun, spotting a flash of orange through the trees. "Go!" he hissed. "I'll draw them off. Get Pip to the team." He broke left, crashing through the brush, his footsteps loud and deliberate. Amelia's breath caught, fear rising in her throat. She watched Ned vanish into the undergrowth, Bellamy's men turning in pursuit, the dogs lunging on their leads. She bit back panic, focusing on Pip. "Come on, baby. Just a little farther." The last few hundred yards felt like a lifetime. Amelia pushed herself past exhaustion, half dragging, half carrying the foal. Branwen nudged them along, refusing to leave, even when Pip faltered. At last, the trees broke apart into a wide, snowy clearing. Across the open space, Amelia saw the neon jackets of the sanctuary staff, 2 volunteers waving their arms, another firing a red flare into the sky. "Over here!" Amelia shouted, her voice cracking. The staff rushed toward them, medical kits in hand. They worked quickly, lifting Pip onto a thick sled, layering him with blankets, checking his vitals, one of them gently stroking Branwen's trembling shoulder. Amelia sagged in relief, her knees giving way. Warm hands caught her. "Are you hurt?" a voice asked. She shook her head, too breathless to speak. Behind them shouts rose, Bellamy's men breaking from the trees, radios blaring. The sanctuary's field leader, a woman with a face carved by wind and worry, stepped between the staff and the intruders, badge glinting on her parka. "This is protected land," she said, her voice icy calm. "You'll stay right there until the authorities arrive." Bellamy himself stormed into the clearing, coat flapping, eyes wild with rage. "Those ponies are trespassers, so is she. I want them back, now!" Amelia found her strength, standing tall between Branwen and Pip. "You tried to run them off your land. You set traps, and you chased us halfway across Northumberland. If anyone's trespassing, it's you. The sanctuary leader raised her radio. Police are already on their way, Lord Bellamy, and I suggest you call off your dogs before you answer for every one of your accidents in court. For a long moment, Bellamy and his men glared, trapped between fury and the rising threat of legal action. Ned stumbled out of the woods, face streaked with sweat and snow, coat torn, but alive. He locked eyes with Amelia, and for a brief, shining second, all the pain and fear dissolved into something like triumph. As the police sirens wailed in the distance, the last of the sun broke through the clouds, turning the snow to gold. Amelia threw her arms around Pip's neck, laughing and crying all at once. Ned knelt beside Branwen, whispering words of gratitude into her tangled mane, and at the edge of the woods, Bellamy stood with fists clenched, fury carved into every line of his face, knowing he'd lost, for now. The forest, the sky, the battered ponies, and the people who had risked everything for them, none of it belonged to him. Not today. In the firelit dusk, under the promise of rescue, hope finally bloomed. Not just for Pip and Branwen, but for everyone who'd chosen to fight for something wild and good, even in the teeth of winter. The snow finally ceased, blanketing the world in a hush that seemed almost sacred. Days passed in a blur of recovery and interviews. Pip, wrapped snug in a heated barn at the sanctuary, dozed in a straw nest, his leg bound in clean gauze, eyes softer, brighter each day. Branwen never left his side, standing guard even as she allowed herself, at last, to eat and sleep. Amelia moved between the barn and the small break room, helping with the ponies, answering questions from the staff and authorities, each moment still wired with adrenaline, unable to let herself relax, not truly, not until she knew they were safe for good. Ned kept to the shadows, never quite at home in the fluorescent-lit rooms or bustling hallways, but always near the paddock at night, keeping watch. He was a man transformed, still haunted, but lighter, a new strength visible in the way he moved. Sometimes he caught Amelia watching him from the window, the two of them sharing a silent acknowledgement. They'd survived, for now, but peace was a brief visitor. Word of what had happened spread quickly, picked up by local press, then national outlets. The tale was too wild to resist. A storm, a chase, a standoff in the woods, ponies rescued from a trap set by a wealthy developer. Outrage blossomed across the country. Journalists clamored for statements. Animal rights groups staged protests outside Bellamy's estate, and the authorities, under mounting pressure, announced a full investigation. It wasn't long before Ned, Amelia, and the sanctuary staff were called to testify in the local courthouse. A squat brick building crowded with townsfolk and reporters, the air thick with anticipation. The cold outside had eased, but tension inside was razor-sharp. Bellamy arrived in a sleek black car, flanked by lawyers, his face set in a mask of cold fury and wounded pride. He swept through the doors with a flock of supporters, their voices a low murmur of outrage and entitlement. The press snapped photos as he entered, flashes painting him in harsh, ghostly light. Ned straightened his battered coat, smoothing the old regimental pin on his lapel. He and Amelia walked in together, flanked by two staff from the sanctuary. Branwen and Pip, meanwhile, became the center of attention in a series of grainy photographs projected for the court. The foal's wound, the fresh scars on Branwen's side, the GPS data that showed the pair's long, desperate flight. The judge, a woman with snow-white hair and sharp blue eyes, called the court to order. "This isn't simply about property," she said. "It's about responsibility, ethics, and the law's duty to protect the vulnerable. I will have civility in my courtroom. We owe that to the animals as well as the people involved." Amelia was first to testify. Her voice was steady, though Ned could see the strain in the way her hands gripped the witness stand. She described following the GPS signal, finding Pip and Branwen wounded and near death, the storm's dangers, and Bellamy's men trying to block their rescue. "I have worked with wild and domesticated horses for over a decade," she finished. "I have never seen a case so clear. These ponies suffered because of deliberate cruelty and neglect, not chance." The judge asked questions, gentle but precise. Bellamy's lawyers tried to rattle her, suggesting she'd trespassed, acted recklessly, or sought publicity. Amelia met each barb with facts, her voice unwavering. She offered medical records, GPS logs, photos, and a small blood-stained scrap of Bellamy's trap as evidence. Next came Ned. He took the stand with a calm that surprised even himself. He described the night of the storm, the rescue, the desperate journey, and the confrontation at the steel fence. He told them how Branwen had bitten through the harness to save her colt, how Pip had nearly died crossing the lake, and how Bellamy's men had pursued them, even when it meant risking the animals' lives. He spoke not only as a witness, but as a soldier who had seen what happens when people with power forget their duty to protect. Bellamy himself was called last. His voice was oily smooth, every word calculated. He claimed the traps were for trespassers and vermin, never meant for the ponies. He accused Ned and Amelia of theft, trespassing, even endangering the animals. But the evidence mounted. The GPS logs, the photos, the testimony of sanctuary staff, and, most damning, the records of Bellamy's orders to his men to make the land clean, uncovered in a series of leaked emails. The hearing stretched on, every detail laid bare. The gallery sat rapt, the press scribbled notes, and outside, crowds chanted for justice, holding signs with Pip's photo. Finally, as dusk settled over the town, the judge delivered her ruling. "Lord Bellamy, you are found guilty of animal cruelty and obstruction of justice. You are ordered to pay all costs for the pony's rehabilitation, to remove all illegal fencing and traps from the land, and to submit to oversight by the Royal Society for the Protection of Horses. The ponies, Branwen and Pip, are to remain under the sanctuary's care until they are fully healed, after which they will be returned to protected common land. This court reminds all parties that land is a trust, not a weapon." A wave of applause broke out, the tension snapping at last. Bellamy sat frozen, fury and humiliation plain on his face. Reporters surged forward, shouting questions as the crowd outside erupted in cheers. Amelia closed her eyes, tears spilling down her cheeks. Not just for Pip and Branwen, but for every wild creature who might now have a safer winter. Ned stepped down from the stand, shoulders square, feeling lighter than he had in years. He met Amelia at the courtroom doors, and together they walked out into the cold, a crowd parting around them like water, the world suddenly wide with possibility. That night, under a sky heavy with stars, the sanctuary glowed with light and laughter. Pip slept soundly for the first time in days, Branwen standing watch as always. The court's victory was not just theirs. It belonged to everyone who had stood up to cruelty, who believed that even the wildest lives deserved mercy. And somewhere on the edge of the forest, a new wind stirred, gentler now, carrying the promise of spring. 6 months later, Northumberland had shed its icy shroud and put on its spring finery. The hills, once white and desolate, now rolled with swells of fresh green and a riot of wildflowers, purple heather, gold gorse, white anemone, spilling across the moorland in great sun-drenched waves. The storm, the chase, the bitter courtroom drama, all of it felt distant and dreamlike in the clear, sharp air of April. But for those who'd lived it, the lessons were still fresh, stitched into every quiet moment, every heartbeat, every grateful breath. The sanctuary was alive with gentle bustle, volunteers greeting the day with laughter, tools in hand, the horses grazing in wide open paddocks beneath a high blue sky. Branwen stood at the far fence, her black coat gleaming with health, mane growing thick and wild again, scars faded to silver lines barely visible in the sun. She nickered softly, nudging Pip, who now matched her nearly in height, his limp almost gone. Where once he'd trembled in pain and fear, now he galloped, tossing his head, hooves flashing with youthful strength. For the first time in his short, hard life, Pip knew what it was to run for joy, not survival. Ned stood beside the paddock, leaning on the fence, a quiet smile touching his face. He had changed in ways he was still coming to understand. The nightmares that had haunted him after Helmand, the sense of being forever trapped in that place, had loosened their grip. Each day spent at the sanctuary, mucking out stalls, mending fences, guiding nervous volunteers, brought a little more peace. He still carried his scars, both seen and unseen, but they no longer ruled him. In caring for Branwen and Pip, he had found something worth believing in again. Amelia joined him, a cup of tea cradled in her hands, her hair pulled back in a simple braid. She wore the light exhaustion of someone who worked with animals and people both, who gave her heart to each with equal stubbornness. They watched Pip canter, watched Branwen toss her mane, watched the volunteers cheering from the sidelines. "They're ready, aren't they?" Ned asked softly. Amelia nodded. "They're stronger than ever. We're releasing them today. The whole staff's coming. Everyone wanted to see them go home." Ned took a long breath, the air sharp with spring, and remembered what Amelia had told him on that first terrible night. Sometimes the hardest thing wasn't to fight, but to let go. The word spread quickly. By late morning, a small crowd had gathered on the edge of the common land. Sanctuary staff, a few journalists, townsfolk who remembered the blizzard, children clutching notebooks and cell phones, the local vicar, even a member of the town council who'd become a quiet advocate for the ponies. The land beyond the fence was awash in sun, the old steel traps and cruel wire now gone, ripped out on the judge's orders, replaced with simple wooden gates and a sense of freedom you could feel in your chest. Amelia led Branwen and Pip to the gate. The mare paused, head high, nostrils flared, drinking in the scent of home. Pip crowded close, nervous but eager, his ears flicking back to catch every word of encouragement. Ned stroked Branwen's neck, feeling the strength beneath her skin, then crouched to scratch Pip's withers. "Go on, boy. Time to run." Amelia opened the gate, the hinges creaking softly. For a long moment, Branwen stood still, uncertain, scanning the open moor. Then, with a sudden joyful lunge, she broke into a trot, then a canter, then a full gallop, Pip thundering after her. The two black forms swept out into the wide world, their hooves stirring the new grass, their tails streaming behind them like banners. The crowd cheered. Some clapped, some laughed, some wiped away tears. Ned felt something catch in his throat, a deep, wordless happiness that brought its own sharp ache. Amelia slipped her hand into his. They watched together as Branwen and Pip vanished over the rise, wild and free, back among the herd, their future once again their own. As the applause faded, the local vicar stepped forward and offered a blessing for the land, for the ponies, for all those who had fought and bled for mercy. Reporters snapped photos, asking for statements. Ned found himself speaking quietly about duty, not just to country, but to the voiceless, the vulnerable, to the wild places that make a land worth calling home. The celebration drifted into the afternoon. Kids chased each other in the grass. Volunteers shared stories from the long winter. Amelia answered questions from the press. The staff gathered for a photo, Pip and Branwen visible far off, running with the rest of the herd, indistinguishable now from the other Fell Ponies. For once, they belonged to the land alone. Later, as the crowd dispersed and the sun slipped westward, Ned and Amelia walked the length of the pasture together. The air was sweet with heather and new growth, the world alive with possibility. Ned felt his heart lighter than he could remember. "You know," he said, pausing at the crest of the hill, "I think you saved me as much as you saved them." Amelia looked at him, her smile gentle, eyes shining. "We saved each other. And them. That's enough for me." They stood in silence, the wind lifting their hair, the cries of wild ponies echoing through the valley. Ned squeezed her hand. "Caring for something, someone outside yourself, that's what keeps the darkness back. I didn't believe that before. Now I do." Amelia nodded. "It's the only thing that ever does." As evening deepened, they watched Branwen and Pip graze beneath the purple sky. The herd clustered around them, safe at last. The moor seemed to sigh in relief, as if the land itself remembered the struggle and was grateful for its resolution. Ned knew there would be new storms, new fights, but he also knew they would not face them alone. Not anymore. He turned to Amelia, his voice low. "Sometimes, saving another life is the only way to save your own." She squeezed his hand back, her voice just a whisper. "And sometimes, doing the right thing changes the whole world, even if it's just for a while." The camera crews left. The staff drifted away, but Ned and Amelia lingered at the fence as dusk fell. The story was theirs now, etched into the land, the hearts of the people, the freedom of two wild ponies who had defied winter, cruelty, and despair. And so, with Branwen and Pip running free under the endless Northumberland sky, the lesson was clear. Mercy is not weakness. Courage is not loudness. And the bonds we forge in the hardest season are what carry us all into the light.